Lands of Evershade is on our table, and of all the games that have ever promised to be sort of like an RPG in a box, and I know we've probably said this before, but I gotta tell you, this one promises anyway. We just have a prototype here with just the very first part of an adventure, but what we've experienced here certainly promises to be the most hand-holding, and I mean that in the most positive sense of the term, method of letting someone experience an RPG straight out of a box.
Yeah, and today we're going to give you kind of an overview of the game, what comes with it, and how it kind of feels like an RPG. And we're going to start right where the game starts, and that is with this player's handbook. Now, the fact that the game comes with a player's handbook already does kind of...
Makes you feel like you're D&D.
Yeah, it just gives you that feel like, here's the player's handbook, create your character. Now, this is not the rules of the game. I know this might seem huge, for not being the rules, but this literally is character creation, just like you'd find in D&D or other role-playing games. There's huge sections on all the different species you can play, or races, all the different classes and backgrounds.
Yeah, but look at this, because one of the things that this game does in general, and it starts right here in the handbook, it doesn't overwhelm. So there's these beautiful spreads, but the information on each page, here's the page that starts with the races you're choosing. You can see, like if you look at a lot of D&D books and modules, there's a lot of text, there's a lot of stuff to do, a lot of tables. This has a lot of that, but it's like little bit by little bit. It makes it feel less overwhelming. And you're like, okay, here's where we're making this decision. Everyone make that decision. Okay, I'm gonna be a dwerg, which is, by the way, their version of a dwarf. And then you move on and it tells you about those races. It tells you like some of the keywords you're gonna get. The other cool thing that happens as you're doing this is a very tactile experience that this game introduces that I haven't seen in many other games. Obviously, there are games that have player boards like this where you're slotting stuff in. But as you're building this, Ryan had that book in front of him, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna do this. And he'd say, okay, here's a choice. Do you wanna be this profession or this profession? I'd say, this profession. Now, they do give you the option to sort of randomly roll those up too. But then I'm getting a token out of the supply for that profession and slotting it in. That token itself has the keywords associated with it. So you're not writing all these things down. And for me anyway, that tactile element, it just reinforces it in my memory that I have those things, as opposed to this big long list where I'm erasing things and adding things.
Yeah, it does.
And you just have them right there.
It feels like that. It feels like making a character in a role-playing game. Really, like you're like, okay, choose your race, choose all these different abilities, you get certain items. But they have streamlined it because this is still a board game. And one of the big ways I think they have streamlined it is not giving you just all of these different like abilities for your, like dark vision and all this stuff. They don't do that. What they do, David touched on it, is almost everything you take, your weapons you take, your items you take, all of the different things that you slot in your player board, like your race, your class, your background, all of them have a set of keywords. Some get more, some get less, but these keywords kind of make up who your character is. So without actually having to remember, oh yeah, I'm subterranean, what does that mean? You see it right there, you are subterranean. And that really only matters when you're playing the game, because things will ask you, hey, is anybody in your party subterranean? Oh yeah, I am, because it says it right there.
Yeah, as you're going through a lot of the, not just checks, but just even the decision making in the sort of choose your own adventure portion of this game, and it must be said, the choose your own adventure portion, at least based on our experience, is pretty significant. We've got this Into the White Well, which is effectively the first adventure, I think. This is a storybook, I think, for just the first adventure. It may be for more, but it says Into the White Well on the front of it, and it's got 1,004 entries in it. Now, these entries do include a tutorial, which is very robust, so you can almost, and I wouldn't say exactly this, but you can almost play this straight out of this without reading the rules.
If you make your character with the player's handbook, by the time you're done with this, it even says, like, you can start now. Like, go through the tutorial.
And we played a little ways into this, so you can see a little further into it. We've gotten into sort of a combat scenario. But even as that happens the first time you're playing this, the tutorial walks you through even like, okay, your first action. And it tells you to move, then attack. And it kind of teaches you a little bit, while at the same time referencing, like, you might want to look at the rule book if you want more details on how this works. But here's how it works.
Which is, we've seen this system before, but I always love it. I love that it kind of walks you through those steps. And it does it by also giving you some decisions to make. I mean, you're making a ton of decisions when creating your character, for example. And by the time you're done with your character, you really do have two sides to your character. You have the non-combat side and the combat side. And this game does weave together combat and non-combat back and forth. So you might be doing some things on one map that are completely outside of combat, and then it might tell you to go to this other map where now you're zooming in and now you're doing combat. But in between all of those, even in between maybe coming to this map to a combat, back to this map, and then who knows where else, you're doing skill checks, you're looking at your keywords, you might be gaining specific entries here based on decisions you make. As you're going through that book, it says, if you made this decision, remember it by putting a little marker on A, and then later it says, did you mark A? Well, now you get to see what happened because of that early decision.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because, and you've probably seen a lot of those types of storybooks. This one in particular, when it comes to the choices of decisions you have, in most games I've played anyway, there's usually like two decisions.
Right.
And sometimes it might say, if you have this keyword, do this. This one, it's like that, to a factor of maybe 3 or 4, because some of the decisions will be in this hierarchy of like, you check the top one first. And it basically says, does anyone have these keywords? If so, go here. And that's where you go. Mm-hmm. You don't even look at the next one. The next one might say, do you have these keywords? Then go here. And you might have some of those keywords, but you have to do the top one first because I'm assuming they've built in that hierarchy to sort of guide you the way you need to be guided.
It locks you out of certain paths or pushes you towards certain paths based on who your characters are. Like, if you have a dwerg, maybe when you're meeting the dwerg, it says, anybody a dwerg? Then you get to do the best thing. You get to do the first thing. Maybe then it says, but does anybody have, nature, which is the second choice? Okay, and then it gets usually progressively worse and becomes harder. It might even get to a point where then you have to make a skill check where we've seen some entries where it's like, if you have this keyword, you just go. If not, you can still try to go, but you have to make a specific skill check. And again, you're rolling dice in this game, of course. You're rolling for skill checks. You're rolling for attacks and combat. There's a lot of dice rolling, but unlike D&D, it does primarily revolve around a D12. You're going to roll all different kinds of dice at different times of the game.
Yeah, they have a whole set here, but the 12s are a big part of it.
The 12s are a big part. And it's basically whenever you're rolling anything, like if you want to make a skill check, it'll say, who has the highest strength? My strength is 3. I get to roll 3 dice. And then it might say, is anybody...
have combat insight.
Right, combat
and I can help.
Or close combat, and you get to roll to help. And all of this is broken down, I think, in a very easy way to understand. It's almost like you have the GM at the table who's saying, all right, well, does anybody have, strength 3 or higher? Okay. Like, it definitely feels like that at times.
Yeah, and that is one thing I want to stress, too. This, to me, felt like, and I don't have a ton of experience playing RPGs like Ryan does, but in my brief experience a few times, when you have a DM that's, like, very nurturing, very guiding, very sort of like, I don't know, maybe try this, for example.
Sure.
This game, more than most games that I've played like this, seems to try to have built in a very helpful, nurturing DM into a lot of the experience because, for instance, on these combat tactical maps, there's oftentimes, in almost all cases that we've seen, one of these sort of special abilities that anyone can take on the map. And I'll say this, I don't want to ruin too much about this, but you're going to face some situations where you're like, okay, there's a few guys, we can take them on. And you just, combat it out.
Yeah.
But sometimes you're going to want to take particularly note of these things because they are inevitably part of the solution that you have to take on. And they're not exactly just straightforward combat. You might be weakening something to immediately take out a ton of guys instead of like taking them on one at a time, because if you take them on one at a time, you're definitely going to lose.
And I think that's an important point to stress. If you're thinking about backing this game or not, if you're trying to decide what kind of game you like, this is not necessarily what I would call a dungeon crawler by any stretch. It might look like one. You definitely have some dungeon rooms, but when I say that it does feel like an RPG in a box, a lot of times there are options the game gives you to either avoid combat, or even if you're in combat, you need to pay attention to your objectives, because sometimes the objectives don't really require you to just kill everything. A lot of those dungeon crawlers, it's like get from point A to point B and fight everything along the way. And I think those are really fun, and I enjoy that style of gameplay, but this is not necessarily that. Because of the way this system works, the way they have these 2 sheets here, you can end up in some really combat heavy where the goal is, yes, eliminate everybody, but you can also end up in somewhere it's like the goal is to get away, or the goal is to go interact with this object or get to a specific spot or whatever. And the way that they use these sheets in combination is, I think, a really unique idea.
Yeah, it is really interesting. This sheet, and you can put these on either side, but there's going to be sheets that have more of a macro perspective, like this is this sort of city map. There's going to be even ones that are larger scale than that here, that you're maneuvering around, oftentimes just exploring what you might expect. This one in particular, which is the first one, so I will use this as a spoiler case. This one is unique, feels like a mini game. This starts the game, you're thrust into a situation where you're chasing this person for reasons that I won't go into. But it feels like a mini game where you're literally chasing this person around. If you catch up with him, you're going to have options that you don't have if you're not caught up with him. He can get away. Eventually, he might get away to the tower gate before you get there. Or you have the option instead of just going to the tower gate and cutting him off when he gets there. You know, the town gate, sorry. It's a really interesting sort of mini game, and the other ones we've seen look very differently. Like there's some, even in what we have, that are just straight up mini games. They're not
puzzles.
Solve. Like puzzles to solve where it's not even really a map, so to speak. But then you have these things here where it kind of goes into the micro, where you're like for instance, I'll tell you again, spoiler alert, we did catch up with the person, and then that immediately, when we successfully sort of tackled him, went into this situation where it kind of like zoomed in on the fight, which is cool. And I think, again, we've only experienced a little bit of the game. There's quite a bit more. This game is very modular, and you can kind of pick and choose what sort of scenarios or campaigns you want to play. But in this case, it did lead to this little combat here. This isn't a significant combat. We've played this combat before. It's not like this big, long, drawn-out thing. And like Ryan said earlier, this isn't a game where you play some story stuff, and then there's always combat. The combat feels peppered throughout.
Like an RPG campaign.
All the different things that you're going to experience in this game, at least again in what we've played, feel kind of like a variety to experience, not just like the same routine back and forth and back and forth. And there's plenty of games like that we all love, but this one seems to feel like it changes that up a little bit.
Yeah, but combat is going to happen, and there's a whole part of your player board that is dedicated to combat. And I kind of like that a lot of what you're doing in the game can help you with both. Like, for example, you get certain weapons or you get certain items or certain equipment, and those come with keywords, and we've already talked about why those are valuable, but they also come with cards, and those cards represent the abilities that you can gain because you have those weapons. So another way that I think that this game feels like an RPG, but a little easier to parse, is that everything you're doing on your turn, all of your actions are right here in front of you on your player board. Each one of these cards that you got, and you're going to get a bunch of these throughout the game, and you're going to have to decide which ones to equip. And you can see down here, there's some little locked areas that only unlock as you level up. So we can start with these 6 different cards, and those are the 6 different actions that we can take. When you take one, it literally tells you from top to bottom everything you need to do, including showing you the range of that attack, showing you the effects of that attack, how much damage it can do. So on your turn, when you're taking your actions, it's very simple to say, okay, well, I'm going to thrust with my polearm. Because I have a spear, it gives me access to this card. And all of the cards are like that. The magic that you learn, everything is kind of done through this card system, which I think does kind of streamline your options at least a little bit.
Yeah, in combat, and we won't go into great detail, but you have 2 actions on your turn, and you can move as well in addition to using some of these actions on these cards, but you're simply moving around. It's a very streamlined
it's very tactical, though. It's very much a grid-based tactical combat using these abilities to the best of your ability, basically.
And then, like I said, there's always some abilities you can use, or oftentimes abilities you can use out on the map. I did want to focus on 2 other things before we leave combat. One are the enemies, and this isn't anything new, but you don't always see this. All the enemies that come out are going to have their own little sort of deck of AI cards. And like we have one enemy out right now that just has 1 card. So once we find out what that is, we know how that enemy is going to behave. But the other ones, as you experience the game for the first time, you're going to be experiencing those cards for the first time. So you don't know what they're going to do. And then those cards are always shuffled in a different order, so you don't know exactly what order they're going to... It almost feels like bosses in a lot of other miniatures games, but for every single enemy like this. The last thing on combat is the initiative is kind of unique. There's this bag of these tokens, and there's going to be some black tokens, some white tokens, and then some tokens that are black or white. The way combat works is, before anyone goes, you draw one of those tokens out. If it's a white token, the players get to go, but you get to choose which player wants to go. So that player takes that token, puts it on their board, they're going to activate. Then you draw another token. If it's another white token, the other player gets to go. If it's a black token, the enemies get to go. And if it's one of the other tokens, you kind of, those alternate. So if we pulled a white first, that one has to be a black. But it's kind of interesting because it kind of feels like a fun, interactive game of chance as it relates to the initiative, but at the same time allows for some tactical decisions to be made.
Oh, for sure. And if it is your turn, you get that white token. Like we talked about, you get to make your 2 actions, and a lot of those actions involve rolling dice. What's interesting, and we have seen this in some games before, but when the enemies activate on their turn, they have a card as well, a lot like your card, that triggers off just top to bottom. They never roll dice. You are always rolling the dice.
Yeah.
So whether you're attacking with one of your attack cards or defending with one of your defense cards, you are the one rolling dice. And they give you a target number, just like if there's a skill check, every enemy has a target number to hit, and every attack has a target number to defend against as well. So it is a pretty easy system, I think, to understand once you grasp it, because attack and defense rolls and skill checks, they're all kind of done using the exact same system.
Yeah, and after you do literally anything in this game, whether it's answer something in a book, complete something on this page, complete an objective here, it'll almost always tell you, okay, get your storybook back out, back to the storybook, and read what it does, and that just kind of keeps you carrying along. Now, I will say, we don't, like I said, have experience with all the scenarios, but from what we've heard, a session can last, it can be short, it can be quite long, but the point of it is, those sessions or the campaigns are very modular. You can take them one at a time if you want. You can kind of build your own sort of custom campaign where you like level up 1 through 4, and then you go to this sort of next stage of adventure and choose different things to do. All the while, if you go through that campaign, keeping track of all of the things that you're collecting. All the cards, all the tokens, everything you get goes in these little, what they call them, pouches.
I think they will be pouches.
This says
for
prototype.
The final. These are very much prototypes.
This says prototype, but it's a little box that we have here that's going to hold all of your stuff. And then stuff on your board. I will say, if you're not going to let it keep it set up, there are going to be a lot of tokens that are on your board that you're going to be pulling back out of your board, unless you store them flat or something like that.
That's the benefit of a double table or table with the topper.
I mentioned this too off the top of the video, but I want to mention it again. The tactile nature of things, not only when you're building your character, but everything on your board. When you go up an experience, you'll knock these little things out of these top slots. You'll take those and you'll put them over in advancements, which you're going to be able to sort of go up like a bit of a tech tree or a skill tree in terms of shaping your character further as you gain experience. You might increase some of your abilities. All these tokens, like everything you see on this player board is practically a token. Even when we got our initial characteristics, then there were some choices we made that said, okay, increase that characteristic by 1. So it really made that experience, again, just like an RPG, but also the tactile nature. I can't stress enough how much more exciting that made it feel to me.
Even the items that you get, the skills that you get, conditions you get, and they tease the secret origins that we have not found, but they say you will find your secret origin. All of that stuff is done in a way that you would, be like you said earlier, erasing and rewriting, but it's all done with these tokens as well. And it does make it pretty easy to just store. Even the combat cards that slot in here, everything can just be kind of fits into a slot in a really smart way, honestly.
So yeah, that is our overview, albeit short, of Lands of Evershade. There is a lot going on in this game. It is an epic campaign game, so I'm sure we've glossed over plenty, but if you have any questions, please make them in the comments below. And if you want to see the game being played, there's plenty of videos out there of it being played. You will have to watch someone read out of a book quite a bit, but a lot of them do get to showing some of the combat, some of how these work. Warning though, it may spoil some of the content for you a little bit, depending on whether or not they change it. But if you have any questions about anything we've talked about, please make them down below. Until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.